Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth. In November 1983, 15-year-old Linda Mann was returning from a babysitting engagement when she was attacked on a footpath known as the Black Pad in Narborough, Leicestershire. Her body was discovered the following morning, bearing evidence of strangulation and assault. The investigation collected biological evidence from the scene, though forensic technology at the time could only establish a blood type profile rather than individual identification. 3 years later, in July 1986, 15-year-old Dawn Ashworth suffered a nearly identical fate near 10-Pound Lane in Enderby after visiting a friend. She had been beaten and strangled, with biological evidence matching the same rare blood type profile found at the Mann scene. Both victims attended Brockington High School, and the similarities between the attacks suggested a single perpetrator operating in the Leicestershire area. The geographic proximity of the crimes, occurring just 3 miles apart, and the matching biological evidence profile convinced investigators they were pursuing someone with established patterns of predatory behavior. The perpetrator had selected victims opportunistically, targeting them during evening hours when they were traveling alone through less populated areas. The strangulation method employed in both cases indicated the perpetrator sought to silence the victims, though forensic psychologists who later reviewed the evidence characterized the acts as driven by psychosexual pathology rather than practical necessity. The investigation took a revolutionary turn when forensic scientist Alec Jeffreys developed a DNA profiling technique at Leicester University. Police initiated the world's first mass DNA screening in January 1987, requesting blood samples from approximately 5,000 men aged 17 to 34 who lived or worked in the area. The unprecedented operation initially yielded no matches, as the perpetrator had avoided participation by persuading a colleague named Ian Kelly to submit a sample using fraudulent identification. The deception succeeded until August 1, 1987, when a woman named Anna Hayter overheard a group of bakery workers in a pub discussing how Ian Kelly had stood in for Pitchfork. She contacted police several weeks later, leading to Pitchfork's arrest on September 19, 1987. Colin Pitchfork, a 27-year-old baker who was married with children, was arrested at his home in Littlethorpe on September 19th. When confronted with the information about the substituted sample, he confessed to both killings. Pitchfork had a documented history of indecent exposure incidents, with investigators determining he had committed over 1,000 such offenses before escalating to these fatal attacks. During the interview process, he attempted to minimize the degree of force used, claiming the victims had not suffered prolonged ordeals. However, this characterization conflicted with forensic evidence documenting the sustained nature of the strangulation in both cases. During an earlier 1986 assault on a woman named Liz Knight, Pitchfork had made statements that revealed his awareness of his escalating behavior. He told Knight, "I haven't hurt you yet, and I may bet you would never accept a lift from a stranger again," demonstrating consciousness of potential for greater harm. Knight's survival and subsequent identification of Pitchfork through the DNA screening provided crucial corroborative evidence beyond the biological samples. At Leicester Crown Court in January 1988, Pitchfork entered guilty pleas to 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of assault, and charges related to perverting the course of justice. The presiding judge sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years, which was later reduced to 28 years in 2009 based on claimed rehabilitative progress, including work transcribing materials into Braille. The judge remarked, "From the point of view of the safety of the public, I doubt if he should ever be released," reflecting concerns about recidivism risk. The victims' families maintained opposition to any potential release throughout the subsequent decades. Dawn Ashworth's mother, Barbara, stated life should mean life when Pitchfork's transfer to open prison conditions was recommended in 2016. As of late 2025, after a series of releases and recalls, including a 2023 parole board decision that was initially blocked by the Justice Secretary. Pitchfork remains in prison following a 2024 ruling that he still poses a risk to the public. What happens when the perpetrator remains undetected for even longer? Marion Crofts. On June 6, 1981, 14-year-old Marion Crofts was cycling to band practice in Fleet, Hampshire, when she was abducted and taken into woodland near the Basingstoke Canal. Her body was discovered the following day, revealing she had been subjected to a brutal assault involving bludgeoning that caused intracranial hemorrhaging, followed by strangulation. The forensic examination noted her mouth had been covered from behind, preventing her from calling for assistance, and a depression in the soil near her body suggested the perpetrator had applied force to her skull with his foot. Notably, there were no defensive wounds on her hands or arms, indicating the attack had commenced with such sudden force that she was unable to mount resistance. Biological evidence recovered from Marion's body and clothing provided the only substantive forensic lead in the immediate aftermath. However, DNA profiling technology in 1981 was insufficient to generate an individual identification from the samples. The case went cold as investigators exhausted traditional leads, interviewing numerous individuals who had been in the Fleet area on the day of Marion's disappearance, but finding no witnesses to the actual abduction or attack. The investigation remained dormant through the 1980s and most of the 1990s, with the evidence preserved but inactive in Hampshire police storage facilities. The breakthrough arrived in 1999, when advances in low copy number DNA profiling enabled forensic scientists to extract usable profiles from degraded biological samples. The 1999 analysis produced a profile with a 1 in a billion match probability, but it was the LCN, low copy number technique in 2001, that allowed investigators to specifically match the profile to Tony Yashinsky after his arrest for an unrelated assault on his second wife. The rarity of this profile meant that identifying the contributor would provide near certainty of perpetrator identity, though the actual identification still required finding a suspect whose DNA could be compared to the evidence profile. That comparison opportunity arose in 2001, when Tony Yashinsky, then 44 years old, was arrested for assault charges unrelated to Marion's case. The routine DNA sample taken during processing for those charges entered the national database and immediately generated a match to the Marion Crofts evidence profile. Investigators arrested Yashinsky in September 2001, exactly 20 years after Marion's passing. Yashinsky had been a 24-year-old Army chef stationed at Aldershot Garrison in 1981, living close enough to Fleet to access the canal area where Marion was attacked. During the investigation into Yashinsky's background, detectives discovered he had a documented history of domestic confrontations. His wife had been pregnant at the time of Marion's attack and had declined intimate relations due to concerns about miscarriage risk. Yashinsky had responded with physical aggression toward his wife shortly before Marion's disappearance, suggesting potential displacement of frustration onto an available victim. However, investigators could not establish whether Yashinsky had specifically targeted Marion or whether the encounter was opportunistic. At Winchester Crown Court in 2002, Yashinsky maintained his innocence despite the DNA evidence, claiming the biological material had been planted by investigators seeking to close an old case. The jury deliberated for 4 weeks before convicting him on both charges. Judge Michael Broderick sentenced him to life imprisonment for the taking of life and 10 years concurrent for the assault, stating, "You have been convicted of the cruel and callous murder of Marion Crofts. The anguish that your action must have caused her parents cannot be imagined." Upon hearing the guilty verdict, Yashinsky muttered, "I can't believe it," his only recorded statement during the proceedings. Marion's father, Clive Crofts, was a retired police officer who had maintained pressure on Hampshire police to continue pursuing leads throughout the 2 decades the case remained unsolved. In interviews following Yashinsky's conviction, Clive spoke of the family's 21 years of torment, waiting for resolution while knowing Marion's killer remained at large. Yashinsky filed an appeal in 2014, which was dismissed as fanciful by appellate judges who found no merit in his claims of evidence tampering. He remains imprisoned, with parole reviews consistently denied based on the nature of the offense and his continued refusal to accept responsibility. The next case would demonstrate DNA's power even when initial charges had been dropped. William Danso and Patrick Dunn. On October 20th, 1993, in the Clapham area of London, 31-year-old William Danso was shot 6 times in the hallway of his home. Danso worked as a bouncer at local nightclubs and had previous confrontations with Gary Nelson, including refusing him entry to a venue and intervening when Nelson was involved in an altercation with other patrons. These incidents, while not extraordinary in the context of nightclub security work, had apparently generated resentment in Nelson sufficient to motivate lethal retaliation. Minutes after the shooting at Danso's residence, PC Patrick Dunn was actually investigating a minor domestic disturbance at a neighboring house when he heard the shots that killed William Danso. As he stepped into the street to investigate, he was shot in the chest by Nelson, who was fleeing the first scene. Dunn was unarmed, following standard British police protocol for routine patrol duties. Witnesses reported that Nelson had laughed following the shootings, demonstrating a complete absence of remorse or recognition of the gravity of his actions. Investigators characterized the motive as stemming from perceived disrespect toward Nelson, with the double homicide representing what prosecutors would later describe as wickedness and complete madness. Nelson, who was 36 years old at the time of the shootings, had operated within London's criminal networks and was known to possess a volatile temperament that escalated disputes beyond proportional response. The initial investigation in 1993 identified Nelson as a suspect based on witness statements placing him near both shooting locations and his established conflicts with Danso. However, insufficient physical evidence connecting Nelson to the firearms used in the shootings resulted in prosecutors declining to file charges. The case remained officially open but inactive for over a decade, with Nelson apparently believing he had successfully evaded accountability. The preservation of ballistic evidence and trace materials from both crime scenes would prove crucial when forensic capabilities advanced. In 2005, DNA analysis techniques had progressed sufficiently to extract usable profiles from microscopic biological traces on the weapons and casings recovered from both shooting sites. When these profiles entered the National Criminal Database, they matched to Nelson through samples he had provided during subsequent arrests for unrelated offenses. This forensic link, combined with the preserved witness testimony from 1993, provided prosecutors with sufficient evidence to proceed with charges. Nelson was arrested and charged with 2 counts of intentional killing and various weapons offenses. At Woolwich Crown Court, Nelson refused to testify in his own defense, maintaining silence throughout the proceedings. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence alongside witness accounts and ballistic analysis demonstrating that the same weapon had been used in both shootings. The jury convicted Nelson on all counts, and Justice Wilkie sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 35 years. In his sentencing remarks, Justice Wilkie noted that both victims had died for no reason other than their jobs, emphasizing the senseless nature of the killings. Police officials characterized Nelson as one of Britain's most dangerous men, given his willingness to use lethal force over minor perceived slights and his targeting of an unarmed police officer performing routine duties. The families of both victims attended the trial and sentencing, with Dunn's widow expressing relief that Nelson would remain incarcerated for decades. The case demonstrated how DNA evidence could resurrect prosecutions that had been abandoned due to insufficient evidence under earlier forensic standards. Nelson remains imprisoned with no realistic prospect of release before he reaches advanced age. If parole is ever granted, given the nature of the offenses and his refusal to express remorse or acknowledge guilt. But what about cases where the perpetrator had no prior connection to the victim? Lena Bruce. On July 11, 1992, 21-year-old Lena Bruce was discovered deceased in her South End apartment in Boston by her roommate. The scene indicated she had been bound and subjected to assault before being asphyxiated. While robbery was a motive, the scene was notably characterized by extreme disarray, including empty soda cans, a beer bottle, and a missing answering machine, and the intercom system had been ripped from the wall. An open window leading to the fire escape indicated the perpetrator's likely entry point, demonstrating opportunistic access rather than forced entry through the main door. Lena Bruce had graduated from Tufts University and was establishing her career as an engineer in the Boston area. Her academic achievements had been exceptional, with one family member noting she was the best student in 40 years in reference to her performance in the engineering program. She had also maintained community service commitments, volunteering with local organizations focused on educational access for underserved populations. Her roommate's return to the apartment at an expected time led to the immediate discovery of her body, providing investigators with a relatively precise timeline for when the fatal encounter had occurred. The biological evidence recovered from the scene and from Lena's body provided the foundation for future forensic analysis. Though DNA technology in 1992 could only establish general profiles rather than definitive individual identification. Investigators pursued numerous leads related to individuals who might have had access to the building or knowledge of Lena's schedule. But no substantial suspects emerged from these inquiries. The case went cold as active leads were exhausted, though Boston police maintained the evidence in proper storage conditions that would preserve DNA integrity. 23 years passed before technological advances and database expansion provided the breakthrough investigators needed. In 2015, a DNA sample from James Witkowski, collected during an unrelated criminal proceeding, was entered into the national database and immediately matched the profile from the Lena Bruce evidence. Witkowski had no known connection to Lena Bruce, had never been identified as a person of interest during the original investigation, and apparently had selected her apartment randomly while seeking opportunities for burglary. The biological evidence indicated the encounter had escalated from theft to assault and ultimately to her demise as Witkowski sought to prevent identification. Witkowski was arrested and charged with first-degree intentional killing. His trial in 2017 resulted in conviction, with the jury deliberating for a relatively short period, given the strength of the DNA evidence and the lack of any alternative explanation for how his biological material came to be present at the scene. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, reflecting both the premeditated nature of the home invasion and the particularly cruel method used to end Lena's life. Tragically, both of Lena's parents passed away before James Witkowski was identified in 2015. However, her sorority sisters from Delta Sigma Theta and other family members maintained a presence during the proceedings to honor her memory. The conviction provided some measure of closure, though family members emphasized that no legal outcome could restore Lena or compensate for the loss of her potential contributions to engineering and community service. Sometimes DNA's power extends beyond identification to exoneration. Teresa Fusco. On November 10, 1984, 16-year-old Teresa Fusco disappeared after finishing her shift at a roller skating rink in Lynbrook, New York. Her body was discovered on December 5th in a wooded area, revealing she had been strangled following an assault. The investigation that followed would become one of criminal justice's most troubling examples of wrongful conviction, as three men, John Kogut, John Restivo, and Dennis Halstead, were charged and convicted based on a coerced confession and flawed forensic hair comparison evidence that later proved unreliable. The three men served 18 years in prison before DNA testing in 2005 excluded them as contributors to the biological evidence recovered from Teresa's body and clothing. The DNA profile extracted from the evidence matched an unknown individual who was not in any criminal database at that time. This exoneration demonstrated the fallibility of earlier forensic methods and the dangers of confession evidence obtained through coercive interrogation techniques. Each of the wrongfully convicted men eventually received financial settlements of approximately $18 million, though no monetary compensation could restore the nearly 2 decades they had spent imprisoned for a crime they did not commit. Following the 2005 exoneration of the Lynbrook Three, the case remained cold until October 14, 2025, when 63-year-old Richard Bilodeau was arrested after DNA from a discarded smoothie straw matched the 1984 crime scene evidence. Investigators obtained a discarded smoothie straw from Richard Bilodeau, a 63-year-old man who had lived in the Lynbrook area in 1984. DNA analysis of epithelial cells on the straw produced a profile matching the evidence from Teresa Fusco's case with sufficient statistical certainty to support criminal charges. Bilodeau was indicted for a second-degree intentional taking of life, though he entered a not guilty plea and has denied any knowledge of or involvement in Teresa's demise. The indictment of Bilodeau, 41 years after Teresa's passing, represented both relief and renewed grief for her family, particularly her father, who stated the family had experienced 40 years of ongoing grief. The long delay between the crime and charges meant that much of Teresa's immediate family had spent the majority of their lives without resolution, compounded by the additional trauma of knowing 3 innocent men had been imprisoned for a crime they did not commit. The motive for the attack on Teresa has not been established through the investigation, as Bilodeau has not provided any statements acknowledging involvement or explaining circumstances. Prosecutors have indicated that Bilodeau lived in proximity to the roller skating rink where Teresa worked, suggesting he may have observed her routine and selected her as a target based on opportunity rather than any prior relationship. The fact that Bilodeau was not identified during the original investigation, despite living locally, indicates he successfully avoided drawing attention to himself at the time. His DNA was not in criminal databases because he apparently had no subsequent arrests that would have required sample submission. The case awaits trial as of late 2025, with Bilodeau maintaining his innocence. The pattern of delayed justice would continue across state lines. Ronald Lee Novak. On December 24, 1983, in rural Walker, Iowa, 24-year-old Ronald Lee Novak was discovered deceased in his home by a friend. He had been beaten, bound, and shot. The scene indicated he had been struck repeatedly with a blunt implement, later determined to be a hammer, causing fatal cranial trauma. The residence showed evidence of theft, with various items missing and drawers searched, suggesting robbery as the primary motive for the home invasion. Blood evidence at the scene indicated the perpetrator had been injured during the encounter, either through self-inflicted injury while wielding the hammer or through defensive actions by Novak before he was overwhelmed. Forensic examination of the scene revealed blood spatters and transfer stains on walls and furniture that did not match Novak's blood type. Additionally, investigators recovered the hammer believed to be the weapon, which contained both Novak's biological material and trace DNA from what appeared to be the perpetrator. The presence of 2 distinct DNA profiles on the weapon provided strong forensic evidence linking the perpetrator to the attack, though identifying the contributor of the unknown profile would require either a confession from someone with direct knowledge or a database match. The investigation pursued numerous leads related to individuals known to Novak, as well as persons with histories of burglary in the Cedar Rapids area. However, no substantial suspects emerged from these inquiries. and the case gradually became inactive as investigators exhausted conventional leads. The evidence was preserved in proper storage conditions, maintaining the integrity of the biological samples for potential future analysis as DNA technology advanced and databases expanded. 40 years passed before genetic genealogy provided the breakthrough that traditional investigation could not achieve. In May 2025, authorities announced the arrest of 64-year-old Michael Shapert in Oregon. After genetic genealogy and DNA testing on a hammer and clothing seized in 1983 confirmed him as a suspect. Shapert, who was approximately 63 years old at the time of identification, had been in his early 20s in 1983 and living in the Cedar Rapids area. Investigators obtained a warrant for Shapert's DNA through either a discarded item or direct court order, and laboratory analysis confirmed his profile matched the evidence from the Novak scene with statistical certainty sufficient to support criminal charges. Shapert was arrested and charged with first-degree intentional killing and burglary. At his arraignment, he entered a not guilty plea, and as of late 2025, the case remains in pre-trial proceedings with both prosecution and defense preparing their arguments regarding the DNA evidence and the circumstances of the attack. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. Yet genetic genealogy would unlock cases even when perpetrators believed they had escaped forever. Catherine Donahue. On March 3, 1979, 31-year-old Catherine Donahue was discovered deceased in a parking lot in Glenarden, Maryland. She had been subjected to a brutal beating and assault before being left at the location. The forensic examination documented extensive trauma, indicating a prolonged attack, with biological evidence preserved from the scene that would remain dormant in evidence storage for over 4 decades. At the time of the incident, investigators pursued traditional leads, including interviews with individuals who had been in the vicinity and examination of Donahue's personal relationships and professional associations. But no suspects emerged from these conventional investigative approaches. Catherine Donahue had been living and working in the Prince George's County area at the time of her passing. No connection was ever established between Donahue and any individual who became a person of interest during the initial investigation. The random nature of the encounter suggested an opportunistic attack by someone who happened upon Donahue in circumstances that provided access and isolation sufficient to commit the offense. The parking lot location, while eventually becoming the discovery site, may not have been where the initial encounter occurred, indicating possible transportation of the victim after the attack commenced. The biological evidence collected in 1979 underwent preservation protocols, standard for that era, though DNA extraction and profiling technologies would not advance sufficiently to generate usable results until decades later. The evidence remained in Maryland law enforcement storage facilities throughout the 1980s, 90s, and into the 21st century, periodically reviewed as forensic capabilities evolved but never producing actionable investigative leads through conventional database matching approaches. The profile extracted from the evidence did not match any individuals in the combined DNA index system maintained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, indicating the perpetrator had either never been arrested for offenses requiring DNA submission or had successfully avoided detection for all criminal activities. The breakthrough arrived in 2024 when forensic genealogists uploaded the unknown DNA profile from the Donahue evidence to public genealogy databases. These databases, populated by individuals voluntarily submitting DNA for ancestry research, allowed investigators to identify distant relatives of the perpetrator by matching segments of DNA inherited through common ancestors. Through painstaking genealogical research involving construction of family trees and elimination of individuals who could not have committed the offense due to age, location, or other factors, investigators narrowed their focus to Roger Zotis Brown, Brown, who was 82 years old at the time of identification, had been living in Pinehurst, North Carolina, having relocated from the Maryland area at some point in the decades following Donahue's passing. His background revealed no documented criminal history that would have placed his DNA in law enforcement databases, explaining why conventional matching approaches had failed to identify him throughout the intervening years. The genetic genealogy research provided investigators with sufficient probable cause to obtain a court-ordered DNA sample directly from Brown for comparison to the evidence profile. Laboratory analysis confirmed that Brown's DNA matched the biological evidence from the Donahue scene, with statistical certainty sufficient to support criminal charges. Roger Zodis Brown was arrested in March 2024 and charged with first-degree murder and assault with intent to murder. However, he passed away in custody on October 18, 2024, at the age of 82, before he could be brought to trial. Because Brown passed away in October 2024, the case was officially closed by the Prince George's County State's Attorney's Office, and no further court proceedings occurred in 2025. Sometimes the person who reports finding a victim becomes the primary suspect decades later. Esther Gonzalez. On February 9, 1979, 17-year-old Esther Gonzalez was walking in Banning, California, when she was attacked. She had been subjected to bludgeoning and assault before being left in a snowpack where her body was discovered shortly after the attack. The individual who reported finding Gonzalez's body was Lewis Randolph Williamson, who claimed to have come upon her while traveling through the area. Williamson cooperated with the initial investigation, providing statements about the discovery and submitting to a polygraph examination that he successfully passed. Based on this cooperation and the polygraph results, investigators eliminated Williamson as a suspect and pursued other leads that ultimately proved unproductive. Esther Gonzalez had been a local resident with no apparent connection to Williamson beyond their presence in the same geographic area on the day of her passing. The attack appeared opportunistic, with Gonzalez becoming vulnerable when walking alone through an area that provided her assailant with sufficient isolation to commit the offense without immediate detection. The snowpack where she was found had preserved certain forensic evidence, including biological material that would prove crucial decades later when DNA technology advanced sufficiently to extract profiles from degraded samples. The investigation in 1979 collected biological evidence during the autopsy, including samples that were preserved according to the protocols of that era. However, DNA profiling technology was not yet available, and the evidence remained stored in California law enforcement facilities for over 4 decades. Periodic reviews of the case occurred as forensic capabilities evolved, but conventional database matching did not generate any investigative leads because the perpetrator's profile was not present in the combined DNA index system. The transformation of the investigation occurred in 2023, when forensic genealogists applied genetic genealogy techniques to the unknown DNA profile from the Gonzalez evidence. The genealogical research generated familial matches that allowed investigators to construct family trees and identify potential candidates for comparison. This process led investigators back to Lewis Randolph Williamson, the individual who had reported finding Gonzalez's body in 1979 and had been cleared based on the polygraph examination. Investigators obtained blood samples that Williamson had provided during his original autopsy, which had been preserved in medical storage facilities. DNA extracted from these samples matched the biological evidence from Gonzalez's body with statistical certainty, demonstrating that Williamson had not merely discovered Gonzalez, but had been responsible for her demise. The polygraph examination that had cleared him in 1979 represented one of the documented instances where such examinations failed to detect deception, highlighting the limitations of this investigative tool compared to biological evidence. Williamson died in Florida in 2014 and his identification as the killer was publicly announced in August 2024 by the Riverside County District Attorney's Office following a genetic genealogy breakthrough. His passing prevented any criminal prosecution, though the identification provided Gonzalez's family with answers they had sought for 44 years. The case was officially closed with Williamson identified as the perpetrator, though no trial would ever occur to present the evidence publicly or allow Williamson the opportunity to contest the findings. Authorities indicated they were examining whether Williamson might have been responsible for other unsolved cases in areas where he had lived or traveled, though no definitive links to additional crimes have been publicly announced. The motive for the attack on Gonzalez has never been established, as Williamson provided no statements before his passing and left no documented explanations for his actions. Another case would reveal how even prominent professionals harbored dark secrets. Nancy Anderson. On January 7, 1972, 19-year-old Nancy Anderson was discovered deceased in her Honolulu, Hawaii apartment. She had been stabbed 63 times in an attack characterized by extreme fury and sustained aggression. The forensic examination documented the extensive nature of the injuries, indicating the assault had continued well beyond what would have been necessary to cause her passing. Biological evidence recovered from the scene included blood on a towel that would prove crucial 5 decades later, when DNA technology advanced sufficiently to generate usable profiles. Nancy Anderson had relocated to Hawaii and was establishing her independent life when the attack occurred. She had expressed concerns to family members prior to her passing, mentioning fear about circumstances in her life, though the specific nature of these concerns was not documented in detail that would guide the initial investigation. The apartment showed signs of forced entry, and the intensity of the stabbing suggested personal rage or psychological disturbance on the part of the perpetrator, rather than a calculated execution. The investigation in 1972 pursued conventional leads, including interviews with Anderson's acquaintances and individuals who lived in proximity to her apartment building. However, no substantial suspects emerged from these inquiries, and the case went cold as active leads were exhausted. The biological evidence from the towel was preserved in Hawaii law enforcement storage, though DNA profiling technology would not become available until years later, and even early DNA testing methods were insufficient to extract usable profiles from the degraded sample. The breakthrough arrived in 2019 when forensic genealogists applied genetic genealogy techniques to the unknown DNA profile extracted from the towel evidence. The genealogical research identified familial matches in public ancestry databases, allowing investigators to construct family trees and narrow their focus to specific individuals who match the age, gender, and geographic criteria. This research pointed toward Tudor Chirila, who had been a neighbor living in proximity to Anderson's apartment in 1972. Chirila's background revealed he had become an attorney and had served as a deputy attorney general in Nevada, achieving professional prominence despite his concealment of involvement in Anderson's passing. His legal career included handling cases involving criminal prosecution, creating the disturbing irony of someone who had committed an unsolved slaying participating in the prosecution of others for similar offenses. Chirila had faced kidnapping charges at some point in his career that were ultimately dropped, though details of these charges have not been publicly disclosed in connection with the Anderson investigation. Investigators obtained a court-ordered DNA sample from Chirila, and laboratory analysis confirmed his profile matched the blood evidence from Anderson's apartment with statistical certainty. Chirila was arrested in 2022 and charged with second-degree intentional taking of life. Following his arrest, he was held in custody in Colorado, where he had been residing, pending extradition to Hawaii for prosecution. Tudor Chirila died in a Honolulu hospital on January 2, 2024, following a suicide attempt, self-inflicted injuries, while in custody at the Oahu Community Correctional Center shortly after his extradition. Anderson's siblings, who had maintained hope for resolution throughout the 5 decades following her passing, expressed relief that the perpetrator had been identified, even though his demise prevented a trial. They noted Anderson's fear prior to her passing, though whether this fear was specifically related to Chirila or to other circumstances remains unclear. The motive for the attack has never been definitively established, though the excessive nature of the stabbing suggested personal animosity or psychological disturbance, rather than robbery or other utilitarian motives. The case was closed with Chirila identified as the perpetrator, though the absence of a trial meant the evidence was never presented publicly in full detail. The power of DNA extended even to identifying serial offenders posthumously. Mary Edith Silvani. On July 17, 1982, 33-year-old Mary Edith Silvani was discovered deceased near Lake Tahoe, Nevada. She had been subjected to assault and was found with fatal injuries from being shot. For decades, Silvani remained unidentified, with her body bearing no identification documents and no missing person reports matching her description, generating investigative leads. She became one of numerous Jane Doe cases in Nevada, periodically reviewed as identification technologies evolved, but remaining nameless until genetic genealogy provided the tools to establish her identity separate from identifying her killer. Silvani's identification finally occurred in 2018 through genetic genealogy techniques applied to DNA extracted from her remains. The genealogical research allowed investigators to construct family trees and contact potential relatives, eventually confirming her identity through comparison with DNA samples provided by family members. This identification, occurring 36 years after her passing, allowed her family to finally know what had happened to her after she had disappeared in 1982. However, identifying Silvani did not immediately reveal who had been responsible for her demise, as the perpetrator's DNA profile still required matching to a specific individual. The perpetrator identification emerged through examination of a series of related cases involving James Richard Curry, who had taken his own life in January 1983, approximately 6 months after Silvani's passing. While in custody in January 1983, Curry confessed to the murders of Gerald and Elizabeth Novoselac and provided information leading to the body of Richard Lemon. But he committed suicide in his jail cell before he could be questioned about other victims like Silvani. His confession indicated he had been operating as a serial offender, though he had not mentioned Silvani specifically before his demise. DNA analysis comparing Curry's profile, obtained through samples provided by his children, to the biological evidence from Silvani's case confirmed the match in 2019. This posthumous identification linked Curry to at least 4 intentional takings of life, including Silvani's case and the 3 he had confessed to before his suicide. Curry was born in Texas as James Richard Blue. He later adopted his stepfather's surname, Curry, which initially complicated the genealogical search until investigators linked the 2 identities. He had spent approximately 20 years imprisoned for robbery and assault charges beginning in the late 1960s. Released at some point before commencing his series of fatal offenses in the early 1980s. Following his release from prison, Curry had worked as a locksmith and operated a storage facility business, occupations that may have provided him access to potential victims and locations suitable for concealing evidence. The motive for his targeting of Silvani has not been definitively established through available evidence, though his pattern of offending suggested a combination of predatory behavior and opportunistic selection of vulnerable individuals. The assault component of Silvani's case aligned with similar elements in other cases attributed to Curry, indicating consistent behavioral patterns across his offenses. A friend of Silvani's, Nancy Cumming, provided statements to investigators remembering Silvani's kindness and expressing relief that her fate had finally been determined. The identification and attribution of responsibility to Curry allowed Silvani's family to achieve some measure of closure, though the fact that Curry had died 36 years before being linked to Silvani's case meant no prosecution would ever occur. Authorities examined whether Curry might have been responsible for additional unsolved cases beyond the 4 definitively attributed to him, though no additional links have been publicly confirmed as of late 2025. Yet another case would demonstrate how modern forensics could close investigations even when the perpetrator died decades ago. Terry McAdams. On February 14, 1985, 22-year-old Terry McAdams, a student at the University of Texas at Arlington, was discovered deceased in the Arlington apartment of her fiancé, where she had been staying while he was away on a business trip. She had been subjected to beating and assault before her passing. The Valentine's Day timing of the attack added a particularly cruel dimension to the offense, with McAdams' life ending on a day culturally associated with affection and celebration. The forensic examination documented extensive trauma, with biological evidence preserved from the scene that would remain unmatched in criminal databases for nearly 4 decades. Terry McAdams had been pursuing her education at the University of Texas at Arlington and was described by family and friends as vibrant and engaged with life. Her sister Karen Hooper later stated, "She was amazing, full of life," when speaking about McAdams following the eventual identification of her killer. The attack appeared to have been opportunistic rather than resulting from any established relationship between McAdams and her assailant, with no evidence of prior contact or conflict that would explain targeted selection. The investigation in 1985 pursued conventional leads, including interviews with McAdams' fellow students, examination of individuals who lived in proximity to her residence, and analysis of anyone who had displayed unusual interest in her prior to the attack. However, no substantial suspects emerged from these traditional investigative approaches, and the case went cold as leads were exhausted. The biological evidence collected from the scene was preserved in Arlington Police Department storage facilities, maintaining its integrity for potential future analysis as DNA technologies evolved. The breakthrough in McAdams' case arrived in 2023, when forensic genealogists with the Federal Bureau of Investigation applied genetic genealogy techniques to the unknown DNA profile from the evidence. The genealogical research identified distant relatives in public ancestry databases, allowing investigators to construct family trees and eliminate individuals who could not have committed the offense based on age, location, or other factors. This painstaking genealogical work eventually focused investigative attention on Bernard Sharp. Bernard Sharp died on November 3, 1985. In a murder-suicide in which he killed his estranged wife and her female friend before taking his own life, just 9 months after the murder of McAdams. Sharp had taken the lives of 2 other individuals before ending his own life, demonstrating a pattern of lethal behavior that extended beyond the McAdams case. The posthumous identification of Sharp as McAdams' killer came 38 years after both the offense and Sharp's own demise, precluding any possibility of criminal prosecution. To confirm the genealogical research findings, investigators obtained DNA samples from a living relative of Sharp's and compared this familial DNA to the evidence profile from the McAdams case. The analysis confirmed the familial relationship and established that Sharp was the contributor of the biological evidence from the scene with statistical certainty, sufficient to close the case definitively. Arlington Police Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation announced the resolution publicly, providing McAdams' family with answers they had sought for nearly 4 decades. The motive for Sharp's attack on McAdams has never been established through available evidence, as Sharp left no documented explanations and the circumstances of his demise in November 1985 prevented any opportunity for interrogation. The absence of any known prior connection between Sharp and McAdams continues to support the theory of an opportunistic encounter, with Sharp happening upon McAdams in circumstances that provided him access to commit the offense. Authorities have not publicly announced examination of whether Sharp might have been responsible for additional unsolved cases beyond the McAdams homicide and the dual homicide he committed before his own demise. The final case would link two separate offenses through DNA decades after both occurred. Diane Olkwitz. On November 3, 1966, 19-year-old Diane Olkwitz was discovered deceased at her workplace in Menomonee Falls, Wisconsin. She had been stabbed over 100 times in an attack of extraordinary brutality and sustained fury. The excessive nature of the injuries indicated the perpetrator had continued the assault well beyond what would have been necessary to cause her passing, suggesting psychological disturbance or rage directed specifically at Olkwitz. Biological evidence was collected from the scene, though DNA profiling technology would not become available for decades. 5 years later, on June 24, 1971, a similar case occurred when a victim was discovered in a Milwaukee field having been stabbed approximately 60 times. The similarities in method and the excessive nature of the stabbing in both cases suggested the possibility of a connection, though forensic capabilities at the time could not definitively link the crimes. Both cases went cold as conventional investigative leads were exhausted, with the evidence preserved in Wisconsin law enforcement storage facilities. The connection between the two cases was definitively established in 2021, when DNA analysis of preserved evidence from both scenes revealed matching biological profiles. This confirmation that a single perpetrator was responsible for both offenses occurring 5 years apart indicated a serial offender who had successfully evaded detection through the 1960s and 70s. However, identifying the contributor of the DNA profile still required either a database match or genetic genealogy research to establish the perpetrator's identity. The identification breakthrough arrived in 2023, when forensic genealogists applied genetic genealogy techniques to the DNA profile, generating familial matches in public ancestry databases. The genealogical research constructed family trees and identified Clarence Marcus Tappendorf as a candidate matching the age, gender, and geographic criteria. Tappendorf had worked as a delivery driver for Claremont Transfer, an occupation that would have provided him mobility throughout the Milwaukee area and potential access to locations where he encountered victims. Tappendorf had died in 2008 at age 80, 15 years before DNA evidence linked him to both cases. To confirm the genealogical research findings, investigators obtained permission from Tappendorf's sons to provide DNA samples for comparison. The analysis confirmed familial relationships and established statistical certainty that Tappendorf was the contributor of the biological evidence from both crime scenes. While investigators obtained an exhumation order, they were able to confirm Tappendorf's identity using a DNA sample from one of his biological sons and a discarded item from another relative, which provided a 1 in a trillion match without needing to complete the physical exhumation. The posthumous identification of Tappendorf as responsible for both cases allowed investigators to close 2 of Wisconsin's oldest cold cases, providing answers to families who had waited over 50 years for resolution. The motive for Tappendorf's attacks has never been established, as he left no documented confessions or explanations before his demise. Authorities examined whether Tappendorf might have been responsible for additional unsolved cases in the Milwaukee area, given his occupation as a delivery driver would have provided extensive geographic mobility. But no additional definitive links have been publicly announced as of late 2025. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.